All right, welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on your time zone. Thank you for joining us for the first part of the webinar series on solar and energy efficiency in low to moderate income communities, LMI communities. My name is Toya Barije, and I work on the SoulSmart program at the Solar Foundation. Today, we're going to explore resources to support local initiatives in LMI communities. So as stated in the National Renewable Energy Laboratory's NREL's report, can low to moderate income households play a role in realizing U.S. rooftop solar technical potential? LMI households are defined as having income levels lower than 80% of the area median income. And as of September 2018, they make up of 43% of the US population. LMI households typically have the highest energy burden, and this is defined as the ratio of energy expenditures to overall household income. So just how can local governments plan for solar and energy efficiency in these communities? Well, our group of presenters are here to give us some insight. So we'll start off with having Megan Mooney from NREL. She is a geospatial data scientist. And then Alex Azanara will present. She's a project leader at the National Renewable Energy Lab, NREL. She's also part of the SoulSmart program. Jeff Cook is the next presenter. He is a renewable energy policy and market analyst at NREL. And then finally, we'll have Stefan Samaparis, who is a senior research analyst for local policy at the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. A warm welcome to our presenters today. So before we begin with the presentation, I would like to highlight that the webinar is being recorded. All attendees are muted, and you will be muted throughout the webinar. After our speakers have completed their presentation, you'll have the opportunity to participate in a brief Q&A. Please submit your questions to the organizer through the question feature through GoToWebinar, or please email me at tbarije@solarfound.org. So this webinar is brought to you by SoulSmart. SoulSmart is a national program funded by the U.S. Department of Energy through its Solar Energy Technology Office. The program is designed to recognize communities that have taken key steps to address local barriers to solar energy and foster growth of mature local solar markets. The goal is to get 300 communities designated by October 2020. And SoulSmart communities either receive bronze, silver, or gold designation. And to help these communities achieve designation, SoulSmart provides no-cost technical assistance from a team of national experts who work with local governments to evaluate programs and practices that impact solar markets and identify high prospect opportunities for improvement. So this map just reflects the geographic distribution of our current designees. We have over 251 designees in 38 states, and one of our milestones is to get to all 50 states. We provide technical assistance that helps local governments enhance solar markets and streamline solar processes, making it easier and more affordable for homes and businesses to install solar. SoulSmart designees receive plaques reflecting their designation level, and these plaques can be displayed in their city hall or administrative buildings. So with that, we'd like to go ahead and start off our webinar, and Megan Mooney will be the first presenter from NREL. All right.
Great, thank you. So I'm Megan Mooney. I'm a geospatial data scientist at NREL. Last year, I co-authored a report with my colleague Ben Segrin titled Rooftop Solar Potential for Low to Moderate Income Households in the United States, where we estimated the technical potential for rooftop PV on all residential buildings in the U.S. at the census tract level, stratified by income, building type, and tenure. One key product of this project was a geospatial web mapping application, which we named Solar for All. Though initially generated as an output of a report, over time, the Solar for All application has grown to house other critical and supplementary data sources from the same general theme, namely the LMI solar and energy equity theme. Today, I'm going to be discussing the Solar for All application and how to use it. Okay, so the Solar for All tool allows users to explore, analyze, and download data in an interactive platform. One key layer in this application is the estimated rooftop solar technical potential for residential buildings with census tract statistics by income, building type, and tenure. Other key layers include average cost of electricity, offsettable electric consumption, energy expenditures, energy efficiency potential, energy burden, location of LMI communities, and among many others. So to give you a better idea of how to use the Solar for All tool, I thought it'd make the most sense to just give you a quick live demo. So we'll start by going to maps.nrel.gov/solar-for-all, which I have already in my window. All right, so as you can see, this is the Solar for All tool. Upon loading, we have a few options. We can either get better acquainted with the features of the app by taking an interactive tutorial for how to use the app's most basic tools, or we can just dive right into the app. The tutorial option is up here. If you'd like, you can take a tutorial that will guide you on some of the most basic functions of the tool, like how to utilize the map controls, how to add and remove layers, etc. If you're not familiar with NREL's OpenCarto web mapping suite, I encourage you to take the tutorial to learn what all can be done with the app. But for now, I'll just dive right into the tool. All right. So as you can see, the default layer is one from our report. It's basically showing the offsettable LMI offsettable electric consumption for LMI single-family owner-occupied buildings in the continental U.S. If we want to know what each color represents, we can toggle to the Legend tab and find what this is showing. And we can see that it's showing the percent of offsettable consumption styled or binned by a diverging palette, with bin breakpoints at the DOE Sunshot goals. If we want to know more about the layer, we can click on the information question mark to read about the layer's description, notes, and sources. We can also choose to download individual layers by clicking on the download icon. Format options include CSV, shapefile, KML, and GeoJSON. We can interact with the data dynamically in the map instead of downloading for offline use. If I click on a point on the map, I can learn more about the attributes and the data behind the layer. This specific county has a LMI offsettable consumption of 71.82. It's in Utah. I can turn on and off other layers and expand the layer tree to learn more about what the app has to offer. I can also choose to explore layers individually or in conjunction with current layers. For instance, I can turn on the boundaries such as states, or counties, and I can go to the Legend tab to play around with the transparency. So those are some of the basic features of the tool. But one of the really neat functions of this tool is that I can overlay data sets for multivariate visualization. For instance, if I'm interested in areas with high levels of LMI potential and high cost of electricity, I can turn on annual generation and average cost of electricity. And overlay them. It's kind of hard to see right now, but when I toggle to the Legend tab, I can play around with the transparency again to get a better sense of how these two layers overlap. In the Legend, I can also choose to turn on and off different bins. So let's say if I wanted to identify the highest potential areas with, let's say, 500 gigawatts or more, and areas that also have extremely high cost of electricity, let's say $0.15 per kilowatt hour, then I can identify in space where these are located. It just gives you a better sense of the distribution of these extremely high it gives you a better sense of the distribution of where there's lots of potential and where the cost of electricity is very high. If I want to be more specific, I can also use some of the built-in app tools to help with the overlay query. Specifically, it's the attribute query. If I go to the query tab here, I can perform an attribute query and specify specific things like average cost of electricity. If I want to know the average monthly bill, where the bill is greater than, say, $100 per month, I can execute this query and download the results or just view them in the tab. All right. Finally, there's also the download data tab, where I can download the replica data set. So the replica data set is rooftop energy potential for low-income communities in America, or replica, and it contains technical potential data displayed in this app, accompanied by several additional techno-economic variables such as electricity expenditures, demographics, utility electric rates, etc., which are all available for download as a flat file. And they're all joined together, so it makes it easier for users to use the data in a tabular form. We think that this data and the app itself provide or help policymakers, researchers, and other stakeholders to have vastly more precise knowledge of the U.S. residential potential. Okay, so I just demonstrated some of the key querying capabilities that allow users to extract meaningful information from the Solar for All app. As you can see, there's a lot of data and content nested in this application. So I encourage you all to spend a little bit of time exploring this app and understanding it a little bit better. This app can be used for a variety of use cases and to answer a variety of questions related to solar for LMI communities. If you have any questions about the application or data within, please feel free to contact me at megan.mooney@nrel.gov. And otherwise, I think my time is up. So I'll turn attention to Alex, who will be presenting the LEAD tool.
Great, thank you, Megan. Hi, everyone. My name is Alexandra Asnar, and I am a project leader here at the National Renewable Energy Lab, or NREL. And today I'm going to speak briefly about a tool called the Low Income Energy Affordability Data, or LEAD tool. The Department of Energy created the LEAD tool in 2016 to assist partners with understanding their LMI community characteristics. The LEAD tool provides worksheets with graphs and data, like some of those on this slide, on key energy affordability metrics. Data sets are available for all 50 states, census divisions, and census tract levels. It's a spreadsheet-based tool accessible through OpenEI. You can see the website link here at the bottom of this slide. And right now, 2015 data is available, but there may be updates every few years pending funding availability. This data is modeled data built off of census household survey data. So this means that at certain granularities, there is some uncertainty with the data, but at greater aggregations, such as the city and county limits, there's greater certainty with the data. So how can you use the LEAD tool? The left-hand column shows the types of data sets that are available on the LEAD tool by different geographic areas. Combined, these data sets can help answer a variety of important questions about energy use, energy burden, and low and moderate income populations. Some examples of these questions are on the right-hand column. These are certainly not exhaustive, but they give you a sense of the types of questions you could answer with this data. Data comes primarily from the Energy Information Administration, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and the Census American Community Survey. As I mentioned, the LEAD tool is currently a spreadsheet-based tool, but at the end of this month, the LEAD tool is transitioning to a new user-friendly web interface. This is an example of what users will see. There will be drop-down menus, maps, and charts, and you'll be able to download maps and charts and save your settings. This is another example of what users will see on the upcoming improved LEAD tool. This map, for example, illustrates total monthly energy costs per household by census tracts in the state of Colorado. You can see how this kind of information would be really useful for local and state policymakers who are trying to design, implement, and evaluate low and moderate income energy efficiency programs. Using the LEAD tool, NREL worked with several communities to analyze and explore their energy data. For example, this graph illustrates the energy burden and average energy expenditures for the residential sector in Carrboro, North Carolina. This chart demonstrates that renter-occupied households have lower energy burdens, that's the orange bar, and lower energy costs, the blue bar, than owner-occupied households in corresponding average medium income or AMI categories in Carrboro. And this is a trend that is not uncommon and may correlate with factors such as the difference in the unit area, household size, and shared walls in multifamily buildings. You can also see that low-income households, those that make up 0 to 50% of AMI, have much higher energy burdens. Again, that's the orange bar. This graph is another example of the type of energy data available on the LEAD tool, this time for New Haven, Connecticut. As you can see, this graph summarizes the number of housing units in the community by tenure and type of heating fuel. You can see that renter-occupied units are more likely to be heated by electricity than owner-occupied units, and that fuel oil is still the heating fuel for a sizable portion of households in this community. This third chart illustrates the average monthly energy expenditures by tenure and by heating fuel type, showing perhaps unsurprisingly that homes heated with fuel oil pay high monthly energy expenditures, which is a situation that is common throughout the Northeast. Lastly, this slide shows how LEAD data was used to show the geographic distribution of energy burden in Rochester, New York. Rochester has one of the highest rates of extreme poverty in the country. It also has a cold climate and older residential building stock, which both affect energy bills, especially in the winter. In Rochester, some families even move to avoid winter energy bills, and this creates a lot of social disruption and family destabilization. NREL worked with the Rochester's Mayor Office of Innovation and Strategies Initiative to explore the nexus of poverty alleviation and greenhouse gas emission reduction using this LEAD data. Rochester wanted to demonstrate that energy burden is a key part of poverty in their city. When you focus on energy burden, it takes into account the inefficiency of buildings and more expensive heating fuels to understand, in addition to household income. So from this analysis, we found that many extremely low-income households live in rental units in this community, way above the ratio in New York and the U.S. averages. 41% of renter-occupied units in Rochester were occupied by extremely low-income households. We also found that 30% of households have an energy burden of greater than 10%, and 7.5% have an energy burden of over 25%. We also found that 3/4 of low-income households in Rochester live in buildings with 4 or fewer units, making multifamily efficiency interventions less effective in this community than in other communities where there are much larger portions of multifamily housing. So those are just some examples of how we've used the LEAD tool for different communities. And I think this could be really helpful for you and your community as you do goal setting, as you plan policies and programs. And it can also provide some data that could support your grant and other proposals. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jeff Cook.
Hi, thanks, Alex. Yeah, like Alex said, I'm here to talk a little bit about how we can unlock the LMI market, in particular thinking about financing and dealing with some of the challenges LMI customers face before they can actually benefit from solar. And so happy to get into that. Let's just do it. There are a variety of challenges, even though there's a lot of technical potential for LMI customers and they can get a lot of benefit out of PV or energy efficiency in general. There are some challenges with them being able to access PV. And first off, it's the upfront cost, usually the most significant barrier to PV adoption. And the second problem that LMI customers can have, even if they have the resources to buy PV, they can also deal with a challenge of a lack of home ownership. And if they're renting, they don't have control over the rooftop and the ability to make decisions about installing rooftop PV, though maybe they can pursue community solar. In the event they do own the home or can agree with the landlord to deploy solar, they can still face challenges with unsuitable home conditions, i.e. problems with the electrical or the condition of the roof itself. And so in addition to those key barriers, or one way to solve those, at least that first barrier, the upfront cost, is to develop innovative financing mechanisms that can help offset those costs and allow LMI customers to adopt these systems and enjoy the benefits of them long term. However, the effectiveness of those financing options can vary depending on the housing type that the individual resides in, potentially single family or multifamily, and then whether or not that individual is a renter or a homeowner can influence the type of project they might pursue, perhaps ground or rooftop solar or community solar. And then lastly, and kind of an overarching issue, is federal housing subsidies. And in particular, the role of these subsidies like housing and urban development subsidies that can influence whether or not an LMI customer can benefit from the PV that's located on site. So those are some of the key issues with financing. And so what was the goal or what's the objective of the work I'm going to discuss today? And that is figuring out what financing options might make the most sense for the various housing types, and understanding in a little bit more detail what factors influence why some of those financing options make more sense depending on the housing type that we're talking about. This work was published back in last year in 2018, so you can find it online. For the purposes of our webinar today, I'm going to talk about these three housing types: single family, multifamily, and manufactured housing. There's a variety of other housing types or variations on these, but we're going to talk about these three key ones in the scope of the webinar today. Before we do that, though, it's important to think about all the financing options that are available to LMI customers that might make sense to support or offset the cost of PV. It's also important to note that a lot of times a variety of these financing options can be used in conjunction with each other to provide a solution for a particular LMI customer. So it's not best to think of them exclusively, though some certainly carry more value than others. And that's what we're trying to demonstrate here. There are a variety of trade-offs that come with different financing options in terms of the ease of implementation on the state administration side, the potential for getting external funding or third-party funding and not state funding. And then thinking about it from the LMI market perspective, not all financing options are the same in terms of their impact on the upfront cost of PV, as well as the potential residential benefit they'll receive, and then the related market potential for that financing option. So you can see here we've organized all the financing options in relation to these criteria, which are more for a a state or local policymaker to consider the different financing options they have and what they might actually do. Once we start looking at the different housing types, some of these financing options will be further elevated or influenced based upon those specific criteria or barriers within those housing types. But this is also fully in the report, and I'm happy to talk through why we organized the financing options in this way in the Q&A section. But I wanted to start, before we dive into each of those three housing types, it's important we talk about the federal subsidy question first, and that's in part because federal subsidies can influence or be used at all housing types. And so we need to understand the influence of these subsidies on the benefits that residents might gain from having PV, and the type of approvals needed for both rooftop and community solar programs for LMI residents that reside within federal housing or receive a subsidy of some type. We're not going to talk about all of the different options for federal housing, but two of the more significant ones are HUD and LIHTC housing, which are listed here. So we're going to talk about each of those in turn, starting with HUD. There are three key programs in HUD that offer housing subsidies, and it's important because each one of those different programs influences the types or how you would get approval for PV or how benefits would be accrued to a LMI resident. Again, there's the key barrier to PV adoption that I'm going to mention here on this slide is the utility allowance methodology. There are three types, asset, community, and site-specific. The most valuable one for ensuring LMI customers that live in HUD housing receive the benefits of the PV put on the roof is a community-based methodology, or a building that has a community-based methodology. This gets confusing in general, but I will just say a community-based methodology allows for utilities to be determined based upon the average utilities in a community for a similar type of house, for a similar house, whether it's a single family, multifamily, or what have you. The asset and site specific put that methodology more specifically to the building itself. And so if you put PV on a home, it reduces the utilities and thereby might reduce the HUD subsidy. And so the individual wouldn't get a benefit. We'll talk a little bit more about those allowances in a second because they also influence LIHTC, which is the other one I'm going to talk about here. The important thing to know is LIHTC housing in general is easier to pass PV benefits to the individual LMI customers because they have individual metering often and they use that utility allowance of the community that's community-based. And so this figure walks through whether or not in green, or the green boxes would suggest that you could pass PV benefits to individual residents that reside within this housing. And then in the yellow and the red, it may be more difficult to do. And so thinking about your housing stock before determining what types of PV projects you might want to do is important to think about. And again, this is complex and difficult to understand. Happy to talk about it a little in the Q&A, and of course, there's the full report. So now let's dig into the top financing options by housing type to give you a better sense of how those 13 financing options stack up on the different types of housing. So here's a summary matrix of all of the top financing options. Again, we're going to talk about the first three there, single family, multifamily, manufactured, and we're not going to talk about community solar in this webinar in great detail. But as you can see, there's a couple that kind of transcend the cases, being direct cash incentives and LIHEAP and WAP funding. And we'll talk about LIHEAP and WAP on the next slide in a little more detail, but direct cash incentives are just providing direct subsidies to offset the upfront cost of PV. So let's talk a little bit about single family homes. And so here we've identified those 5 top financing options, but we've provided an example to offer a little bit more context in how they work. So the important thing to show here is there are examples of communities adopting financing options that can support LMI PV deployment. And I'll talk about LIHTC and WAP on this slide. And so LIHTC and WAP are a Department of Energy and Health and Human Services programs that can be used to provide funding for PV projects. And the Colorado Rooftop Solar Program is one particular example of that. Another potential option for single-family homes is third-party leasing, where you can get a third-party provider involved, such as AppositGen in Connecticut. And you can also have a state role in that to help subsidize or incentivize those third-party developers to come in and provide financing for these systems. We're going to shift over now to some of the financing options for multifamily housing providers. And there's a couple of unique ones here that we're gonna highlight. And that first one is capital refinancing. So first, we've heard that some housing developers have incorporated PV projects into their broader operation and maintenance budget, or when they're about to do a big renovation, as you know, HVAC systems come to the end of their useful life, and you replace them. There have been scenarios where people have incorporated PV projects into that broader financing or that broader portfolio for financing, which makes it a lot more cost effective. There's also been third-party leasing and some pilots of PACE to help support PV on multifamily housing. There is one other I wanted to bring up here on the LIHTC and WAP side. For WAP in particular, there is a requirement that the multifamily housing provider provides some of the funding for the weatherization itself and for the PV project. So that's a bit different from the single family side, where it's where there's no upfront requirement that a single family homeowner pay for a PV system in any way or other weatherization measures. So it just goes to show that there are significant differences between single family and multifamily housing types, and even within the same financing structure, there may be differences like that one that are important to follow or to be aware of. And now we're gonna shift to the third and final housing type that we're gonna cover in this webinar, and that is manufactured housing, like the pictures you see here. So again, LIHTC and WAP can be used for this purpose. However, typically WAP funding has been used, or LIHTC funding has been used for rooftop systems, and it's uncertain whether WAP funding in particular can be used for ground-mounted systems. It's not prohibited, it's just unclear. And this is important for manufactured housing because often the roof can't support PV. However, you can see in that one figure that it is possible, and if you design the home such that it can withstand the weight of the PV, you can do it. It's just if you have an existing one, it may not support it. And so that's why ground-mounted systems may be necessary in that context. In addition, you could do direct cash incentives like the Vermont McKnight Lane project, where the state provided subsidies for the project. This also incorporated battery storage, which was an interesting development in terms of in that it offers a resilience component, which is something that we're seeing folks be more interested in more recently. And then finally, the last two are just tax incentives and PACE. Those are often used for the provider, as mentioned here. The concern for those two, and also for some in the multifamily space, is whether or not leveraging those financial options and deploying PV at the site will actually benefit the LMI customer that lives there. And so when state and local governments consider those incentive structures, they may want to think about how to address that key challenge. And that's all I have today. And so I'm happy to pass it off to Stefan to talk about some of his work.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right. I think we're good to go there. I want to make sure we get the screen all set up and ready to go, but it looks like we're good on that. Okay, everyone. Well, thanks for having me on today. I'm going to try and keep this relatively brief if I can, and cover some of some helpful information, I think, for folks on the line. So again, my name is Stefan Samaritas. I work with the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. And obviously from the name, you can probably guess we're very focused on energy efficiency, but we are doing more that involves solar and other renewable resources these days, and I'll talk about that during this presentation. So I'm going to cover a little bit of sort of the efficiency research that we've done, particularly at the city level, and I'm also going to talk a little bit about some opportunities for integrating efficiency in solar to benefit LMI households. Okay, so let's get going here. So first off, if you're not familiar with ACEEE, that's our acronym, that's the short end for us. We handle all things efficiency. We've been around since 1980. We kind of have two sections to the research work that we do. On the one hand, we do a good bit of research around things like technology, systems, things like building systems, transportation system, but we also do a good bit of work on policy, and that is what I focus on in my work. I'm particularly a member of our local policy team. So we do a lot on the city level, sort of sub-state regional level, those sort of places, counties, that sort of thing. So first off, I just wanted to give you just a little bit of background. So we've been working on particularly energy efficiency as it affects low-income households and also households living in multifamily buildings, which are, I think as probably a number of folks online are probably aware, are also oftentimes low-income residents. We've been doing work on this for a bit, and we've had a couple of projects that have been active for a few years around this topic. In particular, we've delved into this work in about three different ways. One is that we do have a peer-to-peer working group, learning groups. We have two, one that focuses on low-income single-family, the other that focuses on multifamily buildings. Both are centered around topics of efficiency. And the membership for those groups, we have utility program administrators. So these are folks that are administering incentive programs for these customers. And we've had those groups up and running for a few years, and it's an opportunity for folks across the country to share their experience, share their knowledge, talk about issues that they're dealing with, and then also expose them to some of the research that we're doing on a national scale. And also it's really helpful for us because it helps inform the work that we're doing, because we do a good bit of research on this. And you'll see on the right hand of the slide, if you're looking at the slides, that we've got a couple of different web pages where you can go and take a look at our research. The first link there is for our low-income specific research. The second is for anything affecting multifamily. And then one last thing I'll mention is we do a lot of technical assistance for folks that are part of the working group. So we do a lot of work with these programs and helping them expand or maybe set up a new offering, that sort of thing. Now, what I'm going to talk about mostly today, though, is really rooted in research that we're doing as part of our City Clean Energy Scorecard. Now, if you're familiar with us, you may know that for a few years now we've done a city scorecard, but it's been primarily focused on energy efficiency. And in the past, that's covered a number of different topics: local government, community-wide policy, buildings, energy and water utilities, what cities are doing in transportation, and really getting a sense for, in the past anyway, sort of what cities were doing the most when it came to energy efficiency and working to promote that. Now, we've worked to kind of broaden out our work, and especially with the scorecard, with the mindset being that, there are some really pressing challenges that are coming down the pipeline, and cities are, in a big way right now, very focused on things like climate change mitigation and adaptation, and a lot of the policies and programs that we see out there really reflect that focus. And so that's why our focus is kind of broadened out. We're looking now, and we're to assess cities when it comes to their efforts on renewables in several different ways. We've increased the number of cities we're looking at this year. We've gone from 51 to 75. We're also trying to assess folks in more ways in terms of how they're equitably administering and implementing their plans and their policies, and looking at the outcomes for that. So that's some of the changes, and what I'm going to talk about is really rooted in that research. So I'm going to give you kind of a sense on, particularly, first off, we'll just talk about energy efficiency strategies specifically that kind of jump out when you look at the breadth of policies and programs that cities are administering. So energy efficiency strategies that are really benefiting low or moderate income households. And just going to touch this very lightly, I will say overall you kind of find three different approaches. These are strategic ways of going about administering programs or policies. On the one hand, you do have cities that are focused very much on certain building types. In particular, these building types often align with financing, offerings. They align with the way that the construction industry works and builds these buildings. But you'll see oftentimes that a lot of programs or a lot of policies are very focused on particular kinds of buildings, particular sizes of buildings. And so that's one approach, but we are starting to see some other ones that are popping up in recent years. One is you're starting to see more place-based approaches. So when it comes to a city considering maybe an investment that increases efficiency at the local level, one thing that some cities are doing is they're considering the effects of that investment in terms of the community that it's going to be the investment's going into, right? So for example, one thing that a lot of cities are thinking about is, what are the effects of us investing in efficiency in terms of gentrification and displacement of low-income folks who live in a community, right? And so they're thinking very carefully about how to design their programs and their approaches so that they can minimize those negative outcomes. And in fact, in a lot of cases, in some cases, they're working hand in hand with a lot of folks who are in the community to kind of inform and guide how these strategies are going to be implemented. And then one last thing I wanted to point out is that we have seen a couple of cases where folks are really working to integrate efficiency on a very comprehensive level. And by comprehensive, I mean across all agencies. These policies are essentially, the comprehensive housing policies are really thinking through just anything and everything the city does that affects housing, it affects the quality, it affects the affordability, the efficiency, the possibility for implementing or for installing solar on a building, all those sort of things. So thinking through very comprehensively, and oftentimes that employs both building-focused and place-based approaches. It's a really sort of evolving thing. We've seen a couple cities that are starting to get into it, and certainly it seems like there's more to come on that. I've got a table here with a bunch of different strategies that cities take. I'm not going to go through them all, but in general, you can see all sorts of policies and programs that affect low to moderate income households, whether they're in a single family building, whether they're in manufactured housing, whether they're in multifamily housing. One thing I will say is that a lot of times when we talk about low income specific programs is that you're going to see a lot in the incentives category, less so in terms of requirements or voluntary programs. There might be an educational program that works in there, but a lot of times very incentive-based programs. And that's really what I'm going to talk about with my last couple of minutes here. So I just wanted to give, I'm going to give three quick examples of not only just how cities are looking at energy efficiency being beneficial for low and moderate income households in a program they're administering, but also in pairing that with opportunities for installing solar and seeing solar benefit those households as well. So one thing, that I will point out here, I've got an example from Austin, Texas on the slide. There are several cities that have municipal utilities, and the advantage if you have a municipal utility as a city is you can really work hand in hand with the utility in administering programs. And that's been true of Austin, certainly. When you look at Austin, they last year launched a pilot program that was looking to install shared solar on a few multifamily affordable buildings. And the way they sort of paired efficiency and solar in this is they did offer an incentive that was primarily geared at installing the solar. You'll see that on the slide. And the residents of the building were actually the primary beneficiaries of the credits that were accruing from solar generation, energy generation. But one of the ways that they evaluated projects in the beginning was actually looking at the efficiency of the building. So if your building was more efficient, that made you more competitive when it came to this small number of projects that they were looking to do for this pilot. And so that's one way where sort of creative way where you're seeing consideration for efficiency and pairing it with solar and benefiting ultimately low-income folks at the end of the day. In Minneapolis, they have a program right now that's working to enroll owners of small multifamily buildings, small affordable multifamily buildings, in a property tax exemption program that's available, tax abatement program that's available. And it's a really neat program in the sense that not only are they working to target what are called naturally occurring affordable housing, which are just housing properties that are that are already affordable just without any sort of outside subsidy. And they're working to preserve those properties as affordable, and one of the ways they're doing that is through this property tax abatement that's available. But they also realize that those buildings, one of the reasons they're lower rent is because they're maybe not in the best of shape. In many of these cases, you look at buildings like this, tenants can pay a pretty high cost, pretty substantial energy burden, and so they're pairing their 4D tax abatement opportunity with opportunities for energy efficiency gap financing, which is meant to complement some of the utility incentives that are available, and then also opportunities to install solar on the building as well. They're offering a commercial incentive for that. And if you participate in, one of the neat things about this, if you participate in that tax abatement, you receive that, you get priority status to be considered for some of these other financing opportunities for efficiency and for solar. And then finally, this is sort of a very sort of up and coming sort of opportunity. I think in Connecticut, the state has authorized what are called energy improvement districts, and cities can set these up. And obviously, first off, the primary purpose of having an energy improvement district is these are boards, and these are boards that can approve. They can enter into contracts, or they can buy or lease energy facilities. So these boards are primarily focused on increasing distributed energy systems across the community. And they're also working, as in Hartford's case, they're working very closely with their local utility to leverage what efficiency dollars there might be out there in terms of incentives. And while this is a state-authorized opportunity, each city that's approved one of these energy improvement districts has gone through and kind of set specific criteria for how the board is supposed to make decisions about approving investments in distributed energy resources. And so you'll see, if you look on the slide, there's some different criteria that for Hartford's case the board is supposed to consider: increasing efficiency or reliability, advancing commerce or industry. And then the third one is making sure that these projects align with climate action plan values. And there are three of those: public health, economic development, or social equity. And going with the focus on social equity, the board has really thought not only about how it can achieve those first couple of goals that the city's laid out for it, but they're also thinking about a lot of potential investments in affordable properties that are scattered throughout the city. Also thinking very carefully about assets, community assets that might be in need or could be improved with distributed resources and efficiency. that are in specific low-income communities. And so they've gone through, they've made a list. This is, again, kind of early days, I think, for this board, but you see if you look at that, they've got a breakdown online if you want to take a look at it. There's a good list of different projects that they've identified. A lot of those are going to really have an impact on low to moderate income households. And so, again, these are just a few examples. There are not a ton of cities from our research that are, actively working to combine efficiency and solar to benefit LMI households. But there are certainly folks that are, pushing forward on it, and they're working to be innovative. And so these are things to keep in mind. If you're a city, you might think about some of these examples and investigating them to kind of maximize what you can do. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions with whatever time we got left.
All right, thank you so much to our presenters. Special thank you to you. And your presentations were very insightful. So let's just see if we do have some questions. All right, so we did have some questions come in. The first question is for Megan. It is about the Solar for All app. And the question is, are manufactured homes broken out?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So manufactured homes are not included in the technical potential analysis that's represented in the Solar for All app. Basically, technical potential for mobile homes is assumed to be null because roofs are typically not suitable for solar, and without more granular data at the national level, that's the assumption that we make.
Okay, excellent.
If you have any further questions, if you have any further questions about the details, about how things are broken out, the Segrin and Mooney 2018 report does go into greater detail.
Excellent. The second question is for Alex. Alex, for folks who missed this part, when is the LEED tool update being released?
Sure. So the LEED tool is expected to move to that much more user-friendly kind of map-based platform at the end of this month. Right now, it's that spreadsheet tool form. So I would go check in at the end of the month to the OpenEI link that's on those slides, and there will be some announcements about the update.
Okay, perfect. Question for Jeff. You did send me the link to the study, so I will be sharing that with the audience in a follow-up email, as well as the recording for this webinar. The question is, when do you foresee perovskite solar film being commercially available?
Hi, so I think it's probably best if we start with just clarifying what that is in particular. So perovskite solar cells are basically thin film solar, and they're considered a replacement for silicon-based PV panels, which are the typical panels you see today. The idea is these perovskite panels would be more efficient and less costly to produce than typical PV panels. So they're of significant interest right now, and the lab is doing work related to them. And how to commercialize that product. There are some problems. So though we're seeing a lot of high efficiency in the laboratory setting, it's difficult to keep the for lack of a better word, panel stable and keeping that efficiency over time so that it gets exposed to moisture and daylight and just weather in general. And so we're still working on figuring out those issues. And keeping it stable and ensuring the efficiency stays constant over the life of the panel. And so it's hard to say when we will see these commercial and competitive with PV panels that are out there today in terms of market penetration. We might see some type of perovskite panel reach the market perhaps sometime actually next year, but whether or not that panel is actually competitive with the typical silicon-based panels is unclear at this time. So I can't give you a better understanding of that, but I can identify some of the folks here at the lab that are working in that space.
Thank you, Jeff. Stefan, this is for you. Is there a way for audience members to join one of the ACEEE working groups?
Yes. If you, so again, the working groups are limited to, well, the ones that I mentioned anyway are limited to utility program or utility sector program administrators. So there are some folks who administer programs, maybe through a state provider or something like that. Yeah, but if you fit that description and are interested in joining, please send me an email. I included on the slide. I'm sure you'll have that available. But yeah, I'd be happy to talk to you about joining. And even if you're interested in maybe plugging in with us in some way and aren't a program administrator of some sort of low-income or multifamily program, we do have some other opportunities, to get involved with some similar initiatives, and I'd be happy to see if there's maybe something we could plug you in with.
Fantastic. Megan, another question for you. Does the Solar for All app include multifamily data?
Yeah, there's a variety of data sets in the Solar for All app that includes multifamily data. I'm trying to refresh my memory on all that is there. We do have annual generation for multifamily renter occupied buildings, and each of the layers, you'll also notice if you click on the layer itself, it's displaying one thing visually, right? So it's representing one attribute spatially, but then there's a bunch of other layers that are, or attributes that are in the layer tree if you were to open up the pop-up window. So you can actually get more detail about multifamily buildings that may not be necessarily represented in the layer title, if that makes any sense. The replica data set as well has data broken out by multifamily, and so this is total potential and like number of buildings, total number of households, etc. We also have a number of LMI dimension layers and demographic layers that will just sort of categorize and characterize LMI communities by tenure as well.
Perfect. So for the sake of preserving everyone's schedule and keeping time, we do have a few other questions, but I will be sending up a follow-up email with answers to those questions, as well as a link to the recording and any other resources that our speakers would like to share with you. I'd like to again thank you the presenters for their wonderful presentations today. And also to let you know the attendees that there is another presentation next week, May 14th, and it's sort of an expansion on this topic, and you'll be hearing from Denver Housing Authority, DOE, and Grid Alternatives, and they'll really display some of the projects and programs that have succeeded in this space. So please tune into that. I will be following up with that information shortly. And I thank you all for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day.